It was a Tuesday evening, and David Thompson was tired. He'd just finished tutoring a group of struggling students at the community center, something he did twice a week after his regular teaching job. The kids were finally understanding algebra, and that made him smile as he drove through the quiet streets toward home. His wife had texted him earlier about dinner getting cold, adding a laughing emoji. He was looking forward to that meal and maybe catching the last quarter of the basketball game. The streets were empty at this hour. Most families were inside, finishing up their own dinners, helping kids with homework, or settling in for the evening. David had his radio on low, playing some old jazz that reminded him of his father. He was thinking about his lesson plan for tomorrow when he saw the flashing red and blue lights behind him. His heart sank a little, the way anyone's does when they see those lights. He hadn't been speeding. He always drove carefully through this neighborhood. He checked his mirrors and pulled over smoothly, putting the car in park and turning off the engine. He'd been through this before, just routine stuff. A few years back, he got pulled over for a registration sticker that had expired by 3 days. Before that, something about not using his turn signal early enough. Nothing major, just the kinds of things that seemed to happen more often to people who looked like him. The officer who stepped out of the patrol car was a big man, probably in his early 40s, with a thick neck and a walk that suggested he enjoyed the authority of his uniform. His name tag read Hartwell. Behind him, a younger officer got out from the passenger side looking less certain, almost nervous. The younger one hung back near the patrol car while Hartwell approached David's window. David had already rolled it down. He kept his hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen, just like his father had taught him years ago. Just like he'd had to teach his own younger brother. It was a sad lesson to pass down, but a necessary one. License and registration, Hartwell said. No greeting, no explanation of why he'd been pulled over. "Of course, officer," David said, keeping his voice calm and polite. "Can I ask what this is about?" "Your taillight's out. License and registration. Now." David felt confused. He'd just had his car inspected 2 weeks ago. Everything had passed. But he wasn't going to argue. "They're in my glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now, okay?" He moved slowly, deliberately opening the glove compartment and pulling out the documents. His hands were steady, but his pulse had started to quicken. Something about this officer's tone was setting off alarm bells in his head. Hartwell snatched the documents and walked back to his patrol car. David waited, watching in his side mirror. He could see the officer talking on his radio, taking longer than necessary. The younger officer kept glancing toward David's car, then away like he was uncomfortable. 5 minutes passed, then 10. David's phone buzzed with another text from his wife asking where he was. He didn't dare reach for it. When Hartwell finally returned, his entire demeanor had changed. He was more aggressive now, his jaw tight. "Step out of the vehicle." "I'm sorry, what?" "Why do I need to—" "Step out of the vehicle now." Hartwell's hand moved to his belt, resting near his weapon. David's mouth went dry. "Officer, I don't understand what's happening." "I haven't done anything wrong." "You refusing to comply?" Hartwell's voice rose. "That's obstruction. Get out of the car." David's mind raced. He knew his rights, but he also knew that asserting them could make things worse. He knew too many stories about traffic stops that went wrong, about men who never made it home. He slowly opened his door and stepped out, his movements careful and measured. "Turn around, hands on the vehicle." David did as he was told, placing his palms flat on the roof of his car. His phone was in his back pocket, and he remembered the emergency feature he'd set up months ago. If he pressed the side button 5 times quickly, it would start recording and alert his emergency contacts. Very slowly, he shifted his weight and pressed the button against the car's edge. 5 quick clicks. He prayed it had worked. "You carrying anything illegal?" Hartwell demanded, his hands roughly patting down David's sides. "No, sir, nothing. I'm a teacher. I was just coming from—" "I didn't ask for your life story." Hartwell's hands were rougher than necessary, almost violent in their search. "You people always have something to hide." David's stomach clenched. "You people." Those 2 words carried decades of prejudice, and he'd heard them before. But never from someone with a badge and a gun. "Officer, I really don't understand what this is about. My taillight isn't broken. I just had my car inspected." Hartwell spun him around, grabbing his shirt. "You calling me a liar?" "No, I'm just saying—" The first shove came without warning, slamming David back against his car. Pain shot through his spine. He tried to steady himself, his hands coming up defensively. "He's resisting," Hartwell shouted, loud enough for his partner to hear. But David wasn't resisting. He was just trying not to fall. The younger officer took a step forward, his face pale.
"Hey, maybe we should stay back, Rodriguez,"
Hartwell barked. Then came the blows. A fist to David's stomach that knocked the wind out of him. Another to his face that made his vision blur. He tasted blood, felt it running from his nose. He tried to speak, to say he wasn't fighting back, but words wouldn't come. His legs buckled. From somewhere nearby, he heard a door open. A voice shouting, "Hey, what are you doing to that man?" More doors, more voices. Neighbors were coming out, drawn by the commotion. He heard someone yell that they were recording. He tried to focus on that thought, tried to hold on to it as another blow sent him crashing to the pavement. The concrete was cold against his cheek. He could see feet gathering, could hear the younger officer's voice, shaky and uncertain, saying something about calling an ambulance. Hartwell was breathing hard above him, saying words that David's fading consciousness couldn't quite process. His last clear thought before everything went dark was of his wife, waiting at home with cold dinner, wondering why he was taking so long. He thought of his students who'd finally understood algebra today. He thought of his father's lessons about keeping your hands visible, about being polite, about surviving encounters like these. He'd done everything right, and it hadn't mattered at all. The world faded to black as sirens began to wail in the distance, growing closer but not close enough. The hospital room smelled like disinfectant and old coffee. David's wife, Rachel, sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside his bed, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She'd been there for hours ever since she got the call that no spouse ever wants to receive. "Your husband's been in an incident. He's at Memorial Hospital. Please come right away." When David finally opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was her face, and the relief that washed over her expression almost made him cry too. Almost. His face hurt too much to cry. "Everything hurt too much. Don't try to talk," Rachel whispered, squeezing his hand gently. "The doctor said you need to rest." But David needed to know what had happened after he'd blacked out. He needed to understand. Through the fog of painkillers, he managed to croak out a single word. "How bad?" Rachel's jaw tightened. She was a strong woman, always had been, but he could see her struggling to hold it together. 3 broken ribs, concussion, your cheekbone is fractured. They had to do a CT scan to make sure there wasn't any bleeding in your brain. Her voice cracked on that last part. "David, you could have died." The words hung in the air between them. He wanted to say something reassuring, but what could he say? She was right. People had died from less. A doctor came in to check on him, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes who explained his injuries in detail and what the recovery would look like. Weeks, maybe months. Physical therapy for the ribs. No work for at least a month. As she spoke, David kept thinking about his students. Who would teach them? They were finally making progress. After the doctor left, Rachel leaned in close. "There's something else you need to know. Your phone, the emergency recording feature you set up, it worked. Everything got recorded, and it automatically uploaded to the cloud." David felt something stir through the pain and exhaustion. Evidence. There was evidence. "I called your brother, and he gave me the number for that lawyer he knows. Patricia Chen. She's already gotten the recording and she's coming to see you tomorrow." Rachel's expression hardened. "We're not letting this go, David, not this time." While David lay in that hospital bed, something else was happening across town at the police station. Officer Hartwell sat in an interview room with his union representative, filling out his incident report. His knuckles were bruised, and there was a small cut above his eyebrow where David's head had accidentally hit him during the struggle. At least that's what his report would say. He wrote carefully, choosing each word with precision. Subject became aggressive during routine traffic stop. Subject refused lawful orders. Subject struck officer, requiring defensive force to subdue. Subject resisted arrest, necessitating physical restraint for officer safety. It was a story he'd told before, a story that had worked before. His partner Rodriguez sat in another room being questioned by a supervisor. The young officer's hands were shaking. He'd barely slept since the incident, seeing David's blood on the pavement every time he closed his eyes. He kept hearing those words, "you people," echoing in his head. "Walk me through what happened," the supervisor said. A veteran cop named Mitchell who'd been on the force for 20 years. Rodriguez swallowed hard. "We pulled him over for a broken taillight. At least that's what Hartwell said." The guy was cooperative, did everything we asked. But then Hartwell got aggressive and things escalated really fast. Escalated how? This was the moment. Rodriguez knew what he was supposed to say. Back up your partner. The thin blue line. That's what they drilled into him at the academy. What the older cops had reinforced during his first year on the job. But he also knew what he'd seen. I'm not sure, he said finally, the coward's answer. It all happened so fast. Mitchell studied him for a long moment, then made a note on his pad. That's fine. We'll sort it all out. Just remember, we take care of our own here. By the next morning, the police department had released an official statement. It was brief, carefully worded by the department's legal team. Officers responded to a traffic violation and encountered resistance. An individual was injured during the arrest. The incident is under internal review. It said everything and nothing at the same time. No mention of the severity of David's injuries. No mention of the witnesses. Just bland bureaucratic language designed to minimize and deflect. But Patricia Chen, David's lawyer, was not the kind of person who accepted deflection. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for taking on cases that other lawyers avoided. She'd built her career on police misconduct cases, and she'd won more than she'd lost. When she visited David in the hospital, she brought a laptop and a notepad. I've watched the recording from your phone, she said, getting straight to business. It's damning. You can hear everything he said, every slur, every threat, and the sounds of the beating are clear. David closed his eyes, not wanting to imagine what that must sound like played back. But here's the thing, Patricia continued. The phone was in your pocket, so we don't have video. We need witnesses. The neighbors who came out. I need you to tell me everything you remember about that street. About who might have seen what happened. David thought back, trying to push through the fuzzy memories. There was a woman older. She came out of the house right across from where I was parked. I remember her yelling. And I think I saw someone else recording from a porch. Maybe 2 houses down. Patricia made notes. Good. I'll canvass the neighborhood today. And I've already filed a request for any body camera footage, though I'm guessing we'll get pushback on that. She was right. When her request landed on the police chief's desk, Thomas Baldwin groaned. He'd been hoping this would blow over quietly. Another complaint that could be handled internally. But a lawyer this early meant trouble. It meant someone was serious about pressing charges. Baldwin called an emergency meeting with his senior staff. We need to get ahead of this, he told them. Standard internal review process. Put Hartwell on administrative duty until we complete the investigation. What about the witnesses? One of the deputies asked. Word is there were several neighbors who saw the whole thing. Baldwin drummed his fingers on his desk. We'll interview them. But remember, memory is unreliable. It was dark. People were viewing from different angles. We'll get conflicting accounts, I'm sure. It was the playbook, the same one departments had used for decades when one of their own crossed the line. Delay, deflect, create reasonable doubt. Protect the badge. But Baldwin didn't know about the other recordings yet. He didn't know that 3 different neighbors had their phones pointed at that street, capturing different angles of the same brutal scene. He didn't know that one of them had already posted a short clip on social media with the caption, "This is what happened in our neighborhood tonight. This is what they don't want you to see." By that evening, the video had been shared 40 times. By midnight, 400 times. The numbers kept climbing. Patricia sat in her office late into the night, gathering evidence, preparing documents. She'd seen this pattern before, the way departments circled the wagons to protect their own, but she'd also seen what happened when enough pressure was applied, when enough light was shown into dark corners. She thought about David, lying in that hospital bed, his face bruised and swollen. She thought about all the others who'd been in that same position, some who'd survived and many who hadn't. This time would be different. She was going to make sure of it. Patricia Chen made a decision that would change everything. After spending 2 days gathering witness statements and reviewing all the evidence, she knew the police department was going to bury this case if she let them. The internal review process could drag on for months, maybe years, and by then the public would have moved on to the next story. She'd seen it happen too many times before. So on Thursday morning, she walked into the offices of the local news station with a flash drive in her hand. The recording from David's phone was on that drive, along with 2 of the neighbors' videos. She'd gotten their permission to release them, and they'd signed the necessary waivers. They wanted people to know what had happened on their quiet street. By Thursday evening, every news channel in the city was playing portions of the audio. They couldn't show the violence in full detail, but they didn't need to. The sounds were enough. David's calm voice asking what was happening. Hartwell's aggressive responses. The slurs. The impact of fists hitting flesh. The thud of a body hitting concrete. It was all there, clear as day. The video from the neighbors' phones showed the scene from a distance, but you could make out enough. A man pinned against a car. An officer striking him repeatedly. Another officer standing back doing nothing. And throughout it all, you could hear Hartwell shouting things that made people's blood run cold. The response was immediate and explosive. By Friday morning, the police headquarters was surrounded by protesters. It started with maybe 50 people, mostly from David's neighborhood, holding homemade signs. Justice for David Thompson. Fire Hartwell now. No more excuses. But as the day went on and the videos spread across social media, the crowd grew. 100 people. 200. By afternoon, there were at least 500 people standing outside that building, chanting and demanding answers. David watched it all from his living room. He'd been released from the hospital the day before, though he was still in considerable pain. His face was a mess of purple and yellow bruises, and breathing was difficult with the broken ribs. But watching those crowds, seeing all those people standing up for him, made something swell in his chest that had nothing to do with his injuries. "I can't believe this many people care," he said quietly to Rachel, who sat beside him with her arm carefully around his shoulders. "Of course they care," she said. "This isn't just about you anymore, David. This is about every person who's ever been treated like this. Every family who's gotten that phone call. Every mother who's buried a child because someone with a badge decided their life didn't matter. The protests brought news crews, and the news crews brought national attention. By the weekend, David's story was being discussed on cable news shows. Experts were brought in to analyze the audio, the police response, the department's history. And that history was uglier than most people realized. Investigative reporters started digging, and what they found made the situation even worse. Hartwell had been the subject of 5 previous complaints over his 12-year career. 5 times citizens had accused him of using excessive force. 5 times the complaints had gone through the internal review process. And 5 times Hartwell had been cleared or given minor punishments, usually just a few days of suspension. One reporter found a woman named Gloria Hayes, who'd filed a complaint 3 years earlier. Her teenage son had been stopped by Hartwell for skateboarding in a parking lot. According to her complaint, Hartwell had thrown the boy against a wall and used similar language to what he'd used with David. The case had been dismissed due to lack of evidence. There had been no witnesses, no recording, just a mother's word against an officer's report. "I tried to get someone to listen," Gloria told the reporter, tears streaming down her face. "I went to the police station. I filed the paperwork. I did everything I was supposed to do. And they told me my son was being disrespectful. They said he'd gotten what he deserved for talking back. He was 15 years old. More stories emerged. A man who'd been pulled over and searched without cause. A woman who'd called the police for help during a domestic dispute and ended up handcuffed in her own home while her abuser walked free. A teenager who'd been stopped for looking suspicious while walking home from the library. The pattern was clear, and it had been going on for years. The protesters' chants grew louder. "How many more? How many more?" They weren't just talking about Hartwell anymore. They were talking about a system that had protected him, that had ignored the warnings, that had allowed him to keep his badge and his gun, despite a documented history of violence. Inside the police headquarters, Chief Baldwin was in crisis mode. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. The mayor wanted updates. The city council wanted answers. The media wanted statements. And his own officers were divided, some defending Hartwell as a brother in blue, others quietly admitting they'd always known he was trouble. "We need to make an arrest," one of his advisors told him during an emergency meeting. "The evidence is overwhelming. We can't protect him anymore." "If we arrest him, it's like admitting we were wrong all these years," another advisor countered. "It opens us up to lawsuits from every person he ever encountered." "Do you know how much that could cost the city?" Baldwin rubbed his temples. He'd been in law enforcement for 30 years, and he'd never seen a situation spiral this badly, this quickly. "Get me the FBI," he said finally. If they're going to investigate civil rights violations anyway, let's get ahead of it. Make it look like we're cooperating. But cooperation wasn't what the protesters wanted. They wanted Hartwell arrested. They wanted him charged. They wanted him to face the same justice system that had been so quick to arrest and charge people who looked like David. On Sunday, David agreed to do an interview. The national morning news show sent a crew to his house and they set up in his living room. When the interviewer asked him to describe what had happened, David spoke slowly, his words measured despite the pain medication making his thoughts fuzzy. "I did everything right," he said, and his voice cracked slightly. "I was polite. I kept my hands visible. I didn't argue or fight back. My father taught me how to survive encounters with police, and his father taught him. We've been passing down these survival lessons for generations like they're some kind of heirloom, but it didn't matter. I followed every rule, and I still ended up unconscious on the pavement with my ribs broken." The interviewer leaned forward. "What do you want to happen now?" David looked directly into the camera, and despite his swollen eye and bruised face, his gaze was steady. "I want accountability. Not just for me, but for everyone who came before me and everyone who'll come after. I want a system that actually protects and serves everyone, not just some people. And I want officers like Hartwell to know that they can't hide behind a badge anymore. The world is watching now." That interview clip was shared millions of times. David's bruised face became a symbol of something larger than one traffic stop gone wrong. It became a symbol of systemic problems that had been ignored for too long. By Monday morning, the FBI announced they were opening a formal investigation. The pressure had become too intense to ignore. Federal agents arrived at the police station to begin interviewing officers and reviewing files. They requested all documentation related to Hartwell's career. Every complaint, every incident report, every performance review. Rodriguez, the young officer who'd stood by and done nothing, finally requested a meeting with the FBI agents. He sat in an interview room, his hands shaking, and told them everything. Not just about that night with David, but about the culture in the department, the jokes, the casual racism, the unspoken rule that you never, ever testified against another officer. "I should have stopped him," Rodriguez said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I knew what he was doing was wrong. But I was scared. Scared of being labeled a snitch. Scared of losing my job. Scared of what the other officers would do to me." He looked up at the agents. That fear cost a good man his health and almost cost him his life. "I have to live with that." The walls were finally starting to crack. The blue wall of silence that had protected Hartwell for so long was developing fissures. And behind those fissures, the truth was beginning to emerge, ugly and undeniable. The city held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The trial began on a cold morning in February, 6 months after that traffic stop changed David's life forever. The courthouse was packed with people who'd been camping out since dawn, hoping to get one of the limited seats in the courtroom. News vans lined the street outside, their satellite dishes pointed toward the sky like mechanical flowers reaching for the sun. Hartwell walked into the courthouse in a suit instead of his uniform, flanked by his lawyers and his wife. His face showed no emotion, no remorse, nothing. He looked straight ahead, ignoring the cameras and the shouted questions from reporters. His wife, a thin woman with worried eyes, held his arm tightly, as if she might fall without that support. David was already inside, sitting at the prosecution's table with Patricia and the team of lawyers she'd assembled. He wore his best suit, the one he usually saved for parent-teacher conferences and school board meetings. Rachel sat in the front row behind him, along with his brother and several of his fellow teachers who'd taken the day off to support him. The charges were serious: aggravated assault, deprivation of rights under color of law, filing a false police report. If convicted on all counts, Hartwell could face years in prison. But everyone in that courtroom knew that convicting a police officer was never easy. Juries tended to give them the benefit of the doubt. The defense would paint David as a threat. They'd find something in his past, some minor infraction, some way to make him seem less innocent. Judge Helena Martinez entered, and everyone stood. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, known for running a tight courtroom and not tolerating games from either side. She'd been a prosecutor before becoming a judge, and she'd seen enough police misconduct cases to know how they usually played out. "Let's be clear from the start," she said once everyone was seated. "This trial will be conducted with respect and dignity. I won't tolerate grandstanding, and I won't tolerate disruptions. We're here to find the truth, Nothing more, nothing less. The prosecution began their opening statement. They laid out the timeline of that evening, explained the evidence they would present, and painted a picture of an officer who had abused his power in the worst possible way. They promised to show the recordings, to bring forward witnesses, and to prove beyond any doubt that Hartwell had violated David's civil rights. The defense's opening statement was predictable. They admitted that force had been used, but insisted it was necessary and justified. They claimed David had been argumentative, that he'd made sudden movements that Hartwell had feared for his safety. They painted their client as a dedicated officer who'd made a split-second decision in a dangerous situation. Officer Hartwell has served this community for 12 years, his lawyer said, gesturing toward him. 12 years of putting his life on the line every single day. And now, because of one incident where he had to use force to protect himself, his entire career is being destroyed. David felt Rachel's hand squeeze his shoulder from behind. He wanted to stand up and shout that this wasn't one incident, that there had been 5 complaints before him, that Gloria Hayes' son had bruises too. But he stayed silent, trusting Patricia to do her job. The first witness was the medical examiner who'd treated David at the hospital. She described his injuries in clinical detail, showing photographs that made several jurors wince. 3 broken ribs, fractured cheekbone, severe contusions across his face and torso, concussion with associated symptoms that had lasted for weeks. In your professional opinion, what kind of force would be required to cause these injuries? Patricia asked. Significant force applied multiple times, the doctor answered. These aren't injuries from a brief struggle or a single defensive strike. These are injuries from a sustained beating. The defense tried to suggest that David's injuries could have resulted from falling on concrete, from accidentally hitting the car, from anything other than Hartwell's fists, but the doctor held firm. She'd seen thousands of injuries in her career, and she knew the difference between a fall and an assault. Then came the recordings. The courtroom fell silent as David's phone audio played through the speakers. Every word was clear, every slur, every threat, every impact. Some jurors closed their eyes, unable to look at David as they listened to what had happened to him. Others stared at Hartwell, watching for any reaction. He gave them nothing. The neighbors' videos were played next, showing the scene from different angles. You could see David's hands up, see him not fighting back, see Hartwell continuing to strike him even after he'd fallen. One video caught the moment Rodriguez took a step forward, then stopped. His face conflicted. Patricia called the neighbors who'd witnessed the beating. Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who'd been the first to come out of her house, testified about what she'd seen and heard. I've lived on that street for 40 years, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. I've never seen anything like that. That officer wasn't trying to arrest anyone. He was trying to hurt someone. The younger couple who'd recorded from their porch described how they'd heard shouting and came outside to find David already on the ground. We kept recording because we were scared, the husband testified. We thought if we had evidence, someone would have to do something about it. Then came the part everyone had been waiting for. Rodriguez took the stand. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past 6 months. Dark circles under his eyes. Weight loss that made his uniform hang loose when he'd worn it. He wasn't a cop anymore. He'd resigned 2 months after the incident, unable to continue working in a system he no longer believed in. Patricia approached him gently. Officer Rodriguez, can you tell us what happened that night? He took a deep breath. Hartwell said he saw a broken taillight, but I didn't see anything wrong with the car. When we pulled him over, the man, David Thompson, he was cooperative. He did everything we asked. He was calm, polite, exactly how you'd want someone to act during a traffic stop. What happened next? Hartwell started getting aggressive for no reason I could see. He ordered him out of the car, and when the man tried to ask why, Hartwell got in his face. I could tell it was escalating, and I didn't understand why. Did you hear Officer Hartwell use any racial slurs? Rodriguez's jaw tightened. Yes, multiple times. He called him, well, I don't want to repeat the exact words, but yes. Racial slurs, what did you do? This was the question Rodriguez had been dreading. Nothing. I stood there and did nothing. I told myself I was young, that I didn't have the authority to stop a senior officer. But the truth is I was a coward. I watched a man get beaten because I was too scared to speak up. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even Hartwell's lawyers seemed caught off guard by Rodriguez's brutal honesty. Patricia continued. In your time working with Officer Hartwell, did you ever witness similar behavior? Not to this extent, but yes. I saw him be unnecessarily rough with people during arrests. I heard him make racist comments about suspects. Other officers talked about complaints against him like they were jokes. Everyone knew what kind of officer he was, but nobody wanted to be the one to say it out loud. The defense attorney tried to discredit Rodriguez during cross-examination, suggesting he was bitter about his career ending, that he was making up stories to get attention. But Rodriguez didn't back down. He answered every question directly, never wavering from his account. More witnesses followed. An expert on police procedures who explained how nothing Hartwell did that night followed proper protocol. A psychologist who testified about the trauma David had experienced and would continue to experience. Former colleagues of Hartwell who reluctantly admitted they'd seen him lose his temper before. Then the prosecution brought forward Gloria Hayes and two other people who'd filed complaints against Hartwell years earlier. The defense objected, arguing that past accusations weren't relevant to this case, but Judge Martinez allowed the testimony. This speaks to pattern and intent, she ruled. Gloria told her story about her son, her voice steady despite her tears. The other witnesses shared similar experiences. The picture that emerged was damning. This wasn't one bad day or one mistake in judgment. This was a pattern of behavior that had been enabled and protected for over a decade. Finally, it was David's turn to take the stand. He'd been dreading this moment, but he'd also been preparing for it. Patricia had coached him on staying calm, on focusing on the facts, on not letting the defense attorney rattle him. He walked to the witness stand slowly, still feeling the ache in his ribs months later. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, knowing he would have done that anyway. Patricia started with easy questions. His name, his job, what he'd been doing that evening. Then she moved to the traffic stop itself. Can you walk us through what happened from the moment you saw the police lights behind you? David took a breath and began. He described pulling over, keeping his hands visible, being polite and cooperative. He described the confusion when Hartwell became aggressive for no apparent reason. He described the fear that had gripped him when he realized this situation was going very wrong. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. 8 hours that felt like 8 days to everyone waiting outside that courtroom. David sat on a bench in the hallway with Rachel, their hands clasped together, not saying much. What was there to say? They'd presented all the evidence, told the truth, and now 12 strangers held his justice in their hands. Patricia paced near the windows, checking her phone every few minutes, even though she knew the court clerk would notify her immediately when the jury reached a verdict. She'd been through dozens of trials in her career, but this one felt different. The whole country was watching. This wasn't just about David anymore. It was about whether the system could actually hold one of its own accountable. Some of David's students had gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs and candles even though it was the middle of the day. They'd organized it themselves, these teenagers who'd learned algebra from him just months ago. One sign read, "Mr. Thompson taught us justice matters." Another said, "Good cops hold bad cops accountable." Their presence made David's throat tight with emotion. Inside the deliberation room, the 12 jurors sat around a table covered with evidence photos, transcripts, and notes. They'd watched the videos. They'd heard the audio. They'd listened to witnesses describe what happened that night, and experts explain what should have happened. The jury foreman, a middle-aged black man who worked as an engineer, looked around at his fellow jurors. "Let's take a preliminary vote just to see where we stand." The vote was 9-3 for conviction on all counts. 3 jurors weren't sure. One was a retired police officer who kept talking about how difficult the job was, how split-second decisions got judged in hindsight. Another was a young white woman who seemed genuinely conflicted. The third was an older man who admitted he just didn't like sending anyone to prison. "Let's go through the evidence again," the foreman said patiently. The audio recording. "What did you hear?" They listened again. Hartwell's voice, aggressive and threatening. The racial slurs. David's calm responses, trying to de-escalate. The sounds of violence. When it finished, the young woman had tears in her eyes. "I have a son," she said quietly. "He's about the same age as the man who testified, Rodriguez. I keep thinking, what if my son was the officer standing there? What would I want him to do? And the answer is, I'd want him to stop it. I'd want him to be brave enough to say this is wrong. The retired police officer shook his head. You don't understand what it's like out there. Every traffic stop could be dangerous. This man was a teacher coming home from tutoring students, another juror interjected. A Latina woman who'd been quiet until now. He wasn't dangerous. He had his registration ready. He kept his hands visible. He did everything right, and he still got beaten so badly he could have died. We all heard what that doctor said about his injuries. The deliberation went on. They reviewed Rodriguez's testimony about how everyone in the department knew what kind of officer Hartwell was. They discussed the previous complaints, the pattern of behavior. They talked about the fact that the taillight wasn't actually broken, that the whole stop had been pretextual from the start. Slowly, the three holdouts began to shift. The young woman changed her vote first, saying she couldn't ignore what the evidence clearly showed. The older man followed, admitting that his reluctance to convict was about his own discomfort, not about the facts of the case. The retired police officer was the last. I just want to say something, he told the others. I was a cop for 30 years. I know good officers who put their lives on the line every day to protect people. And I also know that people like Hartwell make it harder for those good officers. They make people afraid. They make people distrust everyone who wears a badge. If we don't hold the bad ones accountable, we're betraying the good ones. We're saying the badge matters more than the oath. The final vote was unanimous. When the court clerk's phone rang and she announced the jury had reached a verdict, a ripple of energy went through the courthouse. People rushed back to their seats. The news cameras outside went live. David and Rachel walked back into the courtroom hand in hand, both of them trying to read something, anything, in the faces of the court staff. Judge Martinez took her seat. I understand the jury has reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor, the foreman said, standing. On the charge of aggravated assault, how do you find? Guilty? The word hung in the air for a moment before the courtroom erupted. People gasped, some cried out, others started crying. Judge Martinez banged her gavel, calling for order, but even she seemed to need a moment to compose herself. On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law, how do you find?
Guilty. On the charge of filing a false police report, how do you find?
Guilty. David felt Rachel's hand squeeze his so tight it almost hurt, but he didn't care. He couldn't quite process what he was hearing. Guilty on all counts. It had actually happened. A police officer had been held accountable. Hartwell's face remained blank, but his wife let out a sob. His lawyers immediately began making motions, talking about appeals, but Judge Martinez silenced them with a look. We'll proceed to sentencing in 2 weeks, she said. Until then, the defendant will be remanded into custody. She looked directly at Hartwell. Bailiff, take him into custody. For the first time, emotion crossed Hartwell's face. Shock, maybe fear. The bailiff approached with handcuffs, and the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in that room. The man who'd put so many people in handcuffs was now experiencing it himself. As they led him away, he looked back at his wife once. She was crying openly now, torn between the man she'd married and the truth of what he'd done. David almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Outside the courthouse, the crowd of supporters erupted in celebration when the news spread. Strangers hugged each other. David's students jumped and cheered. People who'd been following the case from across the country felt like maybe, just maybe, something was changing. 2 weeks later, they were back for sentencing. Judge Martinez had reviewed all the evidence again, read the victim impact statement David had submitted, and considered the arguments from both sides. Officer Hartwell, she said, looking down at him from the bench. You were given a badge and a gun and the authority to enforce the law. That authority comes with tremendous responsibility. You violated that responsibility in the worst possible way. You used your power not to protect and serve, but to brutalize and harm. You targeted Mr. Thompson because of the color of his skin, and you nearly killed him because your hatred was stronger than your duty. She paused, letting her words sink in. I've read the previous complaints against you. I've heard the testimony about the culture that enabled you, and I've seen the recordings of what you did that night. This wasn't a mistake or a lapse in judgment. This was a choice you made, a choice that represents a pattern of behavior that should have been stopped years ago. I hereby sentence you to 7 years in state prison on the assault charge, to run concurrently with your federal sentence on the civil rights violation. I'm also recommending that the state revoke your law enforcement certification permanently. You will never wear a badge again, 7 years. It wasn't enough to undo what had happened, but it was something. It was accountability. It was justice, or as close to it as the system could provide. The changes that followed happened slowly, but they happened. Chief Baldwin resigned 2 days after the verdict, unable to withstand the pressure and criticism. The city appointed a new chief, a woman who'd built her career on community policing and reform. She immediately implemented new policies requiring body cameras for all officers, created an independent civilian review board for misconduct complaints, and instituted mandatory training on de-escalation and implicit bias. Rodriguez, the former officer who'd found his courage too late, became an unexpected voice for reform. He traveled to police academies and departments around the country, telling his story and explaining how the culture of silence had to change. "I was wrong," he told audiences over and over. "I was a coward when it mattered most. Don't be me. Be better than me." David slowly healed, though some wounds went deeper than the physical ones. He had nightmares sometimes, waking up feeling like he couldn't breathe, like someone was pressing down on his chest. Rachel would hold him until the panic passed, reminding him he was safe. He was home. It was over. He returned to teaching, though it took him a while to feel comfortable driving at night again. His students welcomed him back with a banner and cupcakes, and several of them told him they wanted to become lawyers or civil rights activists because of what he'd been through. That made him proud and sad at the same time. The settlement from the city came through $2.3 million. David and Rachel kept some of it, enough to pay medical bills and set aside for their future. But David donated a significant portion to organizations that provided legal aid to people who'd experienced police misconduct, people who didn't have Patricia Chen to fight for them. A year after the trial, David was invited to speak at a national conference on police reform. He stood at a podium in front of hundreds of people, officers and activists and politicians and regular citizens who cared about justice.